Immediately after Donald Trump's statement about seriously considering withdrawing from NATO, allies reacted instantly. But ironically, instead of standing by their elder brother, the UK, France, and over 40 other nations gathered to find a solution to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and notably, the US was not included. This is no longer a mere diplomatic detail, but a comprehensive shift. While the US remains the party most directly and deeply involved in the Middle East hotspot, the fact that allies are breaking away to handle the issue shows they no longer automatically follow Washington's leadership. Analysts observe that when an ally acts increasingly unpredictably and leans toward unilateralism, the rest of the system is forced to self-adjust to mitigate risks. When standing with the US no longer equates to safety or effectiveness, it is inevitable that nations will seek their own solutions. The Hormuz story, therefore, is not just a meeting. It is a sign that the familiar order is beginning to crack from within the heart of the US alliance system. Looking deeper into the matter, the core issue no longer lies solely with the Strait of Hormuz or any specific conflict, but rather in the Allies' exhaustion with US actions. For decades, the Western security structure operated on a fairly clear principle. The US makes decisions and allies coordinate. However, in recent times, especially under Donald Trump, that principle has begun to reverse. The US has acted increasingly unilaterally, particularly in hotspots like the Middle East. Decisions regarding Iran, from exerting pressure and military escalation to offensive moves, were made with almost no substantive consultation with European allies. The problem is, as long as things remain under control, this approach might not trigger a strong reaction. But when the situation spirals out of control, it is the allies who must bear the consequences, from trade disruptions and energy crises to security risks. At that point, the question arises, why should they continue to follow a strategy they were not allowed to help shape? The response from Europe, especially France, is therefore not spontaneous. Paris's refusal to participate in military operations against Iran is actually a very clear message. They do not accept being dragged into a conflict where they had no voice from the beginning. This is a massive departure from previous eras when NATO operated almost as a unified bloc under Washington's leadership. In other words, what is fracturing is not just a military alliance, but trust in the US role as the driver. In geopolitics, once trust has eroded, restoring it is far more difficult than maintaining military or economic power. Meanwhile, the conflict in the Middle East itself is evolving in an increasingly uncontrollable direction. While past confrontations were often bilateral, for example, Iran versus Israel, the battlefield has now expanded into a multi-point network. Iran no longer acts alone. In the north, Hezbollah in Lebanon constantly pressures Israel with rocket attacks. In the south, Houthi forces in Yemen participate with ballistic missiles and drones, even threatening strategic maritime routes like Bab el-Mandeb. These forces do not just operate independently, they possess a certain level of tactical and objective coordination, forming a type of informal alliance countering the US and Israel. Notably, the nature of warfare has also changed. These are no longer traditional military clashes, but a combination of various forms: long-range missiles, UAVs, and proxy forces. This makes the conflict fragmented, unpredictable, and particularly difficult to control. There is no clear front line to extinguish, but rather multiple hotspots erupting simultaneously. As war transcends purely military boundaries, it begins to spill over into other sectors, especially economics and technology. Reports of targets related to US tech giants like Oracle or Amazon being aimed at to whatever degree show a dangerous trend. Global economic infrastructure is becoming part of the battlefield. When this happens, risks are no longer confined to the Middle East, but can spread across the entire international economic system. In this context, Donald Trump's declaration that the US no longer needs the Middle East and can let other nations take responsibility for protecting maritime routes like Hormuz makes the situation even more complex. Strategically, this is a major shift. For decades, the US has played the role of guarantor for maritime security and regional stability. Withdrawing, even partially, means leaving a power vacuum. Here, Iran clearly possesses the geographical advantage and the motivation to increase its influence. When the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most vital oil transit routes, is threatened, the ability to control or influence this route becomes a crucial strategic lever. This carries not just military significance, but serves as a tool for global economic pressure. Meanwhile, Gulf nations find themselves in a difficult position. They rely on maritime security to maintain energy exports, yet lack the capacity or willingness to confront Iran directly. As the US role diminishes, they are forced to fend for themselves in an increasingly unstable security environment. Global consequences are almost inevitable. Rising oil prices are the market's immediate reaction to supply disruption risks. But more profoundly, Europe bears the greatest pressure, as the region is heavily dependent on imported energy. Conversely, energy exporting nations like Russia could benefit from this very instability, both in terms of pricing and geopolitical standing. Overall, three factors are occurring simultaneously: declining trust in the US, uncontrollable military escalation, and the emergence of a power vacuum. When these three factors intersect, the result is no longer just a regional crisis, but a sign of a larger shift in the global order. Looking at the latest developments, there is a very striking detail. The world is no longer waiting for the US, but has begun organizing itself to handle the problem. The meeting of over 40 nations, led by the UK, to discuss reopening the Strait of Hormuz is the clearest example. The participants span from Europe and Asia to the Middle East, reflecting the global impact of this crisis. Yet, the most conspicuous part remains that the US, the country that initiated and is most deeply involved, is standing on the sidelines. This is not an accidental absence, but a deliberate choice from both sides. On one hand, Donald Trump has publicly stated that nations dependent on this shipping route should take care of it themselves, instead of relying on the US. On the other hand, the allies themselves are no longer keen on being dragged into a strategy dictated by Washington. They have chosen to come together, prioritizing diplomatic and economic measures, and even considering military options, but in a multilateral way that does not place the US at the center. At the same time, another more systemic development is unfolding. The United Nations is preparing to bring the Hormuz issue to a vote in the Security Council, with the possibility of authorizing nations to use all necessary measures to protect the maritime route. This shows the international community is seeking to legitimize a collective intervention mechanism rather than relying on a single superpower as before. When placing these two developments side by side, the big picture becomes clearer than ever. On one side are nations self-organizing and self-coordinating. On the other are international institutions like the UN being reactivated. Both share a common point: the role of the US is no longer the default center. In reality, this is not a sudden shift, but the result of an accumulative process. For years, allies were used to US leadership. But as that leadership became unpredictable, unilateral, and lacked consultation, they were forced to recalculate. Hormuz is merely the breaking point where all previous contradictions have surfaced at once. A notable detail is that in international meetings, the focus of discussion is no longer what the US will do, but what we will do together. This is a massive shift in mindset. It shows the international system is gradually moving from a unipolar model where the US holds the central role to a more fragmented state where multiple centers of power coexist. Of course, this does not mean the US role disappears from the chessboard. The US remains the leading military and economic power. However, its status as the game organizer is being questioned. And when that status wavers, the way the world operates begins to change accordingly. The profound consequences of this shift do not lie solely in the Middle East. It opens a broader scenario. Nations will become increasingly proactive in protecting their own interests instead of depending on a single axis of power. This may make the system more flexible, but it also means global consensus will be harder to achieve than before, and that is the point worth reflecting on. The issue is not that the US has weakened to the point of being unable to lead. The issue is that, in the eyes of many allies, the US is no longer a stable enough partner in which to place absolute trust. In geopolitics, power can create influence, but trust is what maintains the system. When trust begins to crack, even a superpower cannot hold its position as it did before.